Hello, so today we're going to be talking about U.S. history. We're going to start off with exploration and then how it developed into colonism, and then from there, the American Revolution occurred. Alright, so let's go ahead and give this a title. So we're going to break this lesson for today into lesson 1. Call this exploration. To colonization. And then from there, we had the American Revolution. And if you look at the history of other empires where there was imperialism, basically where beyond their geographical borders, they went out, usually through the use of a navy, and conquered other distant faraway lands. The United States was not the only colony for the British Empire. India and several other regions were also colonies, but in the end they did revolt. When you're not geographically placed together, it's very hard to fight down an insurrection. Let me just adjust. So let's start from the very beginning. And let's use lots of different colors to be colorful. Get these ready to go. So if you look at a map of the United States or of North America, this should have been pointing outward. That's supposed to be Florida. Okay. So all of this is a crude representation of what North America looks like today. Well, before it was frozen over and actually connected to Asia over here. And it was frozen over and there was a land bridge, and this land bridge was called the Bering Strait. So people moved from Asia into the Bering Strait, and then they moved downwards, finding warmer climates and following different animals that they were hunting. This was back in the time of hunters and gatherers, so they would just follow the large prey across the land bridge. So this went on from North America, and they just continued going all the way down into South America. So the people who ended up settling here, those are the people we call Native Americans. You might hear them be referenced as Indians. People who are Indian, they're from India. The reason Native Americans are incorrectly called Indians was because when an explorer landed in North America, they thought they had reached India and mistook the people from being from India instead of, oh look, I actually stumbled across an entirely new continent. Okay, so let's put a timeline here. So this was before. So this was the migration. Of nomadic people from Asia to North America, across the Bering Strait. The descendants of these people are known as Native Americans. So my drawing is going to be much cruder right now. So this is meant to be Europe. And over here is Asia. So traders would go from Asia for their wonderful spices, their silk, and other things, and they wanted to get this into Europe. Likewise, people in Europe wanted those things. They wanted everything. If you think of the Middle Ages, things look very bland, and yes, things might have also tasted very bland as well. But with the beautiful items from Asia, people from Europe would have to cross different mountains, very treacherous and sometimes very dangerous roads in order to get to certain parts of Asia. So some people thought, and not knowing the existence of North America and how large the Pacific Ocean was, they thought, well, you know what, why don't we just get a little boat, not a little boat, and just try to sail that way, and then eventually we'll come back to Asia. This is how someone who was trying to get to India mistook the Native Americans and called them Indians instead. So if we look at a timeline in the 1400s, they're looking for gold and spices. So European explorers searched for a sea route to Asia. In order to get around, because there's also like land here, huge treacherous desert here as well, which is the Middle East, large portions of desert. They would sail all around Africa, and it would be just significantly larger trip and just have to go around. And also you need to take into account that since they were on the other side of the equator, the seasons are opposite. So right now it's becoming summer in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, south of the equator, it's actually winter. So that really just makes it much harder to plan and pack and prepare for people who are going on sea voyages. So this was around the 1400s, and then in 1492, some of you might mention cabeza de vaca, who is mentioned for like discovering other parts. Yes, that is correct. However, just for the purposes of the GED, I'm gonna just give you what you need for the exam following their material criteria, but you are more than welcome to further research this topic if you'd like. So then we have 1492, Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus went to Spain, which was this portion of Europe, and said, hey, King and Queen, would you please finance an expedition for me to try to find a route to Asia? And it was actually him who actually arrived to North America and thought it was India. So Christopher Columbus was financed by Spain to find a sea route. Other people who followed after was like, yo, dude, this is a totally different world. And they called it the New World. Technologically speaking, Europeans were more technologically advanced in some areas compared to people in the North America. So they call themselves like the Old World, and then North America and subsequently South America were considered New World because it was new to them. So there's like, oh, free. If some of you know the meme, it's free real estate. This is exactly what all these other nations thought. Like, well, I might be a very tiny country, but I want to have a bunch of, if I am able to conquer these new areas, I can then have access to their resources. Remember, this is where there was like heavy taxes, and then like tensions between countries at this time period were kind of tense. People were always uncomfortable. It was a very rough time to be alive. So if you had access to more resources, you would have a more comfortable lifestyle, longer life expectancy. So yes, colonization did seem like an awesome idea. So then, other countries, as a result, other countries or other nations set up colonies. And this was great for trading. Different nations had different approaches. For example, the French were a little bit more laid back. Some people were focused on actually searching for gold. That was Spain's main focus, gold, gold, gold. Other countries wanted natural resources that they had, even certain crops, even certain animals. You needed to take into account that horses were not native to North America, but people from Europe brought them over. Same thing with ants. They weren't in North America, but they were brought over by Europe. And turkey did not exist in Europe. So then they brought over turkey, different corn, a lot of other crops that normally did not that were not indigenous. Indigenous means like it started there. Were actually able to grow in different areas. Like potatoes, they didn't grow in Europe, but since they were brought over, it had a great climate or great conditions for potatoes, specifically in Scotland, and it began to flourish. Okay, so now we like fast forward like a couple hundred years. So then from the 1500s to the 1600s, and you may wonder, why a couple hundred years? Like, even now, like if you just change things 10 years, a lot of things happen. Well, travel was very slow, and ships took a long time, and it was very expensive, and people would die along the way. So it wasn't as easy as like calling up an Uber on your phone. So we are going to specifically focus on Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands. So Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands. They established their colonies. Here I say other nations set up colonies. They're kind of doing their own research and background and information on it. Some nations were pretty smart. They let other countries kind of get a head start to know, hey, is there like any monsters or any like diseases that'll be brought over? Well, for the Europeans, they didn't have much diseases that they were exposed to. However, smallpox, big problem in Europe, but since like different waves had already been like passing through Europe, different parts of the Dark Ages, people had developed an immunity to it, or at least a big tolerance. So when the Europeans came over to North America, the North Americans did not have that immunity. These group of people had not been exposed. They had split off from the Europeans when they had traveled much earlier, when they traveled along the Bering Strait, back when people were still nomadic, and they didn't have this immunity. So when you're exposed to something that you have no immunity to, you will have the strongest reaction towards it. So this caused massive deaths with the North Americans, which made it a lot easier to take away their lands and have access to their resources. So it was much easier for the Europeans, like, oh wow, even less resistance. Okay. So with this, it actually provided the resources, provided wealth to the nation, well, to the mother country, and it also gave some people a place to stay. Certain parts of Europe were very crowded. Real estate was pretty hard, pretty difficult. So a lot of people just had to end up staying in North America, who are Europeans, in order to like extract said natural resources. And at one point in 1607, we have Plymouth. And Plymouth was a permanent residence. This is where we have the Pilgrims. This is Jamestown, Virginia. Well, modern day Virginia. So we have Jamestown in 1607. There was other colonies that were already existing. For example, Roanoke, which mysteriously disappeared. But in 1607, this is the first permanent English settlement. And this is huge, permanent. People are gonna stay there. It's been held long enough. People have been able to survive the winters and haven't died off or haven't gone running back to Europe. If you look into the history of Jamestown, some people just completely slacked off, and there wasn't enough food, so like people starved to death. A lot of people starved to death. So then afterwards, the leaders said, if you don't work, you're not going to eat. So if it was that rule, because there was just like so many people, but only a few of them were the ones that ended up working. They had taken for granted their a good season and weren't prepared for the harsh season of winter. And winter is gonna come, and some people had underestimated North America for being an easier way of life, where in comparison, it wasn't, you couldn't just buy soap from the little shop. You actually had to boil fats and make it for yourself. It was a rude awakening for some people who weren't prepared for it. So then we actually have in 1620, we have our Pilgrims, and these are our okay, so this goes, there's a little more background on this. So this actually comes from people who were being persecuted throughout different parts of Europe. They had been in different parts, like moving around, but due to religious persecution, they asked the King of England, hey, may we have your blessing and just go on to North America. We don't want to be influenced by your worldly ways, and we want to be free to practice our religion and uphold our piousness. King said, yep, go for it. So these were the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. There were other ships, but they did not make it. Again, this is where it's a very high mortality rate going across the Atlantic Ocean. Nowadays, we can just like fly over it. Then, so this was the second English colony on Mayflower, and they arrived in Massachusetts. Okay, so this one right here is the first permanent English settlement. And then in Massachusetts with the Pilgrims, this would be the second permanent English settlement. There we go. Now, it took a fast forward to 1967. I'm sorry, not 1675. This is where there is a bit of a grim past of our. The colonies began to import a large number of slaves that had been captured in Africa and sold into slavery. And they were put on plantations, specifically on the southern colonies, because northern colonies didn't really grow crops very well, whereas the south, nice and warm, nice and sunny, very rich, fertile soil, they were able to have more success. And Europe did start with indentured servants. Sometimes they would be agreed to like being a servant for 7 years. There's a difference between servant and slave. A servant says like, hey, I'll work for you, but I'll still get paid, and like at the end of our business relationship, like I can walk away from it. And so what some people do is, it says they couldn't afford traveling to North America, they would say like, hey, it'll kind of be like a work-study relationship. You fund my trip over there, and I will go ahead and work for you for 7 years. But after those 7 years is up, I'm totally free. With slavery, the person is forced against their will, and there is no expiration date unless they are bought by someone else who is more benevolent and then freed, or with death. So that this was a chance to exploit people for profit. So 1675, colonies started importing African slaves to their southern colonies. So you may ask yourself, well, why didn't they turn the Native Americans into slaves? They found it just much easier to subdue someone who had just been totally removed from their culture in Africa and then just placed to be a slave. They wouldn't have anywhere else to run to. So this would kind of create a Sherlock syndrome, where they would have to depend on their slave owners. Whereas a Native American, they know the land, they know where to go. They can just, if you leave them alone and let them be free outside, they'll run away, and they can have a better chance of escaping versus someone who was removed from their content, just plays in a totally different kind of world. Also, in this mindset of the European traders, they saw that the Native Americans, or people who were native to the Americas, not just the United States, and also including like the Mexico areas and then Central America, because that's also part of North America, they could not handle too much abusive behavior. Whereas they had already noticed with their colonies in Africa, the people were stronger and they were better equipped for the heat of the South. For those of you who live in Texas or also in the southern states, you know it's very hot and very humid. If you didn't grow up in that area, or if you're not used to doing a lot of exercise outside, it is very difficult to adapt. So this is where they began to, in a way, outsource their labor into slave labor. Okay, so then now we're going to move into the 1700s. All right, so at that point, there was just like explosive growth in the colonies. They were doing so well. So then there was a fight, a war that happened in England and France versus that it was with England versus France. It was called the French and Indian War. So this war lasted from 1754 to 1763. This was the French and Indian War. England was the winner. England won. And they gained more territory. Won and gained a lot of France's new territories. France's, specifically the American colonies. So after getting even more territory in America, and you have to administer it. That it's more territory. It has to require more supervision, have more diplomats go across. England said, like, oh, you know what? I gotta tighten my grip on my original 13 colonies. They didn't want to spread themselves too thin. So, to avoid spreading, spreading their administration too thin. It really is just spreading their control too thin, but like spreading control makes it seem like it's more. Spreading their administration too thin. They tightened up. England tightened its grasp. Tightened its grip on the 13 colonies. So the 13 colonies, when you look at the United States flag, we have 13 red and white stripes. That's just paying homage to our original 13 colonies. Okay, so they needed to tighten their grip. Also, war is expensive. So England said, like, you know what? I gotta like extract even more resources. I have a bunch of debt. So then they started increasing taxes. Plus, oops, seems my camera was shifted. There we go. So England incurred a lot of debts. Basically, had large debts, and usually countries would borrow from each other. So now, if you owe another country something, while going to war, after you win the war or lose the war, that other country might end up invading you. Like, hey, like, you owe us money. England had large debts. So then in reaction to that, increased taxes. On 13 colonies. And now, for those of you who are homeowners, if all of a sudden if they build new school districts in your area and your taxes go up, or let's say like you live in one city and then you move to another city, sometimes even as adjacent city, for example, like in McAllen Mission area, here in Hidalgo County, the taxes are nearly doubled if you live in Mission. So it's very drastic sometimes, having to go through taxes, especially if you're doing a lot of international trade, like large taxation, as we see our laws of supply and demand, high taxes. Oh, it's not as much benefit for the people who are doing trade, so they're going to cut back on trade. So increased taxes. Colonies don't like it. So these colonies also, since they're over here on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, and then we have Europe over here, they were fighting a different war, even though the colonies were English and all practical purposes. They were having a different identity. They had a different way of life. Not so much administration. They had kind of like started forming their own identities. So like when like England came and tightened its grip, it's like, whoa, It's all of a sudden like having a very cool mom who becomes all of a sudden stricter with you. It's going to be met with resistance by the children. Same thing with the colonies. They did not like it. So after 1763 this happened, but then it wasn't until 1775. So once you're able to have a tax, and it's met, so if some of you remember when there was a shortage of eggs because of the salmonella, egg prices rose because they were having to destroy a lot of chickens and also a lot of the eggs. And after the supply was replenished, they kept the prices high because the egg companies saw like, hey, it's so vital. People are still going to buy our eggs at these prices. So we're just going to leave the eggs as expensive as they are. People are going to buy them anyway. More profit for places that sell eggs. Same thing with the with England. So like, hey, we can get away with these higher taxes. Why are we going to lower them? Remember, at this point, England was still a monarchy. So there wasn't like other bureaucratic oversight. So then here in 1775, this is when we actually had skirmishes. So a skirmish is not a war. A skirmish is just a little fight. It's a little fight. It doesn't mean anything. It's very, very local. It doesn't mean much in the grander scheme of things. However, just the fact that there was just so many different skirmishes occurring between England as representatives and also in their military versus colonists, it just shows like there was so much tension in the air, a lot of conflict. And it just became so much harder to ignore. So then in 1776, 4th of July, 4th of July, this is when our Declaration of Independence occurs. Now, we do call 1776 the birth of a nation, the birth of the United States, but we weren't technically free from England until much later. There is different people who got together and said, you know what? We're tired of this. We don't want to deal with this anymore. We want to be just our own nation. Goodbye, England. They all drafted up a document, called it the Declaration of Independence, and sent it off. In their minds, they were a different front. They were the 13 colonies put together. When England got news of that, they were not happy. It's one thing to get your taxes lowered and not be receiving as much funding for taxes. And it's another thing to totally lose your source of natural resources and a large source of income. An example is like if you get reduced a couple of hours on a certain week versus completely losing your job. Yeah, big difference. So the person who headed the Continental Congress, assigned George Washington to lead the Continental Army. Continent, North America, 13 colonies. So George Washington was assigned to lead the Continental Army. George Washington, he is the fellow on the $1 bill. He was also the first president of the United States after the war. So we have the American Revolution. It basically lasts from 1776 until 1781. So this was the time of the American Revolution. So the last battle is at Yorktown. British surrender at Yorktown. However, so like, it's one thing for an army to surrender because, you know, they're gonna die, or they just realize that all hope is lost. But then it's another thing for the political head of the nation, the one in the comfy seat who is not putting their life on stake, to surrender. They might just send new troops and like, hey, my life's not on the line. I really need these resources. So it actually took 1783. So it took 2 more years. Of course, it wasn't as easy as sending an email. They did have to like have back and forth correspondence, but still 2 years, still quite a bit of time. This is when this was the final treaty signed, recognizing independence of the colonies. I do want to point out, though, that with the American Revolution, they didn't have the more technologically advanced numbers, and also the more better funding for the war compared to, at that point now, that was the British Empire. However, they did have friends helping them fund their war. So there's an old adage saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So France had a grudge against England. It's like, ooh, I gotta know a good way to get back at them. I'll help out their new enemies. So France started helping the United States, the 13 colonies, in their revolution against Great Britain. So that was actually a great move on their part. So then here, when we have the final treaty, these 13 colonies are kind of trying to like work together. So they actually start out not totally as a nation. They start out as a confederation. So you might think, oh, Confederate, isn't about talking about the people in the South from the Civil War? Yes, it does. It seems like it's kind of like the states. Now, we kind of like have mutual aid agreements. We kind of cooperate together, but laws are very different from state to state. So we started off with the Articles of Confederation. So this was basically a loose confederation. So they weren't really tied to each other. The different colonies, there was actually more emphasis on local government. At first, they weren't really keen on the idea of having like a really strong nation. the people were just really distrustful of a central form of government, especially having been under rule of a monarchy. However, this was not effective. It was not strong enough. If one of the colonies was suffering, they couldn't really ask for more help from their other sister colonies. So there is a need for centralized government. So this is when now we have the U.S. Constitution, and the U.S. Constitution holds true today. So the U.S. Constitution was made in 1788. Still, people were really concerned. So then we have the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights isn't talking about the powers of the government. The Bill of Rights is talking about the rights of the citizen. Remember, they had just come from being oppressed. They wanted guarantees for their personal freedoms, like freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. So they guarantee of individual freedoms. Now this is very different, and this is protecting it within a certain degree. For example, if there is a right to bear arms, but there is not a right to have a tank and pointing it at a daycare and threatening to detonate explosives where there's people. That is encroaching on other people's individual freedoms. So no, that would not be protected. Same thing with freedom of assembly, as long as it is peaceful, but if it's resulting in, if there is riots and damage of personal property and harm to life, then yes, that is no longer protected. And that's very much of the times right now. That still applies today. Okay, so next we're going to be talking more about westward expansion. So the colonies have already been established. So the second, seem to have misplaced my pen. There it is.